All right, we're picking up on our second video about connective tissue. In our first video, we covered the connective tissue proper, the loose connective tissues, and the dense connective tissue. We'll pick up today with the supporting connective tissue classification, and we'll talk about cartilage and bone. So we have three types of cartilage that we're going to identify: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage, and then two types of bone: spongy bone and compact bone. So the first thing that I want to mention is we've talked about different cells that produce the extracellular matrix in our tissues. So in cartilage connective tissue, the cell is called a chondrocyte. So these are essentially cartilage cells. So in the space that they occupy, or the space around these cells, is called lacunae. Just like with our other connective tissue, we have extracellular matrix, and we're going to have the presence of different protein fibers in different amounts. So we're going to see collagen, the presence of collagen fibers, and elastic fibers. Now, the cartilage tissue is going to be stronger than the last category we looked at, which was the dense connective, but it's going to be more flexible than our bone tissue. Now, remember, avascular tells us that we don't have blood vessels in this tissue, and so cartilage is going to be avascular. And we'll talk a little bit as we look at each type of cartilage that when we don't have vascular tissue, we don't have a regular supply of blood, this can make injury to the tissue, cause it to heal slowly. So again, we have three types we're going to look at: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Our first type of cartilage we're going to look at is hyaline cartilage. This is the most common type in the body. And when we're thinking about the histology of these kinds of tissues and how we would look at and identify them, one thing you want to look at is the cells that are in the tissue, the chondrocytes, are irregularly found throughout the tissue or throughout the extracellular matrix. Now, in the image you see, and commonly you'll find that these tissues are stained in a specific way with eosin and hematoxylin. And when they're stained with that technique, the chondrocytes look like possibly bubbles or even together like little deer tracks. Where do we find hyaline cartilage? Well, first of all, it's what's going to form the fetal skeleton and then, of course, be replaced by bone. We also find it in our respiratory tract, in the trachea, the bronchus, and the larynx. So in there, when we have the tube that goes to the stomach, the esophagus, and the tube that goes to the respiratory system, the esophagus is made of smooth muscle, but the trachea includes cartilage. We also find it when we talk about bones later in the semester. We'll talk about the presence of this type of cartilage at the epiphyseal growth plates and at the ends of long bones. Next type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. This is what we would think of as weight-bearing cartilage because it's important because it absorbs shock and it resists being compressed. Now, when you look at tissue samples, what you'll notice is that this is made up of many parallel collagen fibers. So we can actually see those in these samples, in the illustration and in the histological sample. Now, the chondrocytes are going to look larger in fibrocartilage than in hyaline cartilage. Now, where do we find these? So in your vertebra, in your spinal column, in between the discs, or in between the vertebrae, are intervertebral discs. These discs are made of fibrocartilage. We also find this in the meniscus of the knee and in the pubic symphysis. Elastic cartilage is our third and final type. This is going to be, as the name implies, elastic, more flexible. And essentially we have many of these elastic fiber type protein fibers that form a net or a web around these chondrocyte cells. So as you can see, the fibers are not where we saw in fibrocartilage. They were more parallel. We have a more net-like appearance of the fibers in this tissue. Okay, flexible. So if you take your ear, right, the external part of your ear, and you fold it over, right, it comes back, it retains its shape. That's an example of this type of cartilage. It's also in our epiglottis, which is the structure that prevents, when you swallow, it prevents food from going down into your respiratory system. All right, so we've covered cartilage, and now we're going to move to bone and cover compact and spongy bone. So this is the most solid type of connective tissue. It's not going to be flexible like we saw with our cartilage. However, bone is highly vascularized, so we do have a good blood supply. Now, the chondrocytes were the cell found in our cartilage, but in bone, they're called osteocytes. The extracellular matrix of bone is going to have some collagen proteins and glycoproteins, but we're also going to have some mineral components, so calcium phosphate, or sometimes called hydroxyapatite. So the two types are spongy, and we'll see when we look at the tissue, it sort of forms a lattice work. Whereas in our compact bone, we have these osteocytes that form osteons around this calcium phosphate collagen extracellular matrix. So here is a comparison of the spongy bone and the compact bone. Let me just turn my pen on here for a second. Okay, so on the left we have spongy bone, and so what we see is, we see that it sort of forms like these, we might call them little fingers or projections, trabeculae that form throughout the bone tissue, and then we have spaces right in between those. Now the compact bones, we have an illustration up here. So for example, this is coming from one of our long bones, and the compact bone then is going to be right here, right? Whereas our spongy bone is found at the ends of the long bone. So what we see is, these circular structures, these are what we call our osteons. And you can see that we have a nice blood supply and we have nerves throughout the bone tissue. Now, right here in this microscopic image, we can see the presence of these osteons, right? And in the middle there, this white space would be where we would find our blood vessels and our nerves, and all of these little darker spots, right, that look sort of like a tree ring around those are all individual osteocytes, right, that are forming that osteon tissue. And our final tissue that we're going to look at is fluid connective tissue. So this includes blood and lymph. So blood we're probably familiar with. We're going to look at that. Lymph is derived from blood plasma. We have lymph vessels that carry lymph, and ultimately this lymph fluid is returned back to our blood system. Let's take a look at blood. Now, what exactly is blood? Well, blood has both a liquid portion, so we call that the plasma. So in this case, the extracellular matrix is just liquid. That's what the plasma is, the extracellular matrix. So we don't have any protein fibers or minerals. Now, blood also has what we call formed elements. So this includes cells and platelets. So the cells come in the form of either white blood cells or leukocytes, which we've talked a little bit about the presence of leukocytes in other tissues, and red blood cells or erythrocytes. So our red blood cells are important in transporting oxygen to our cells and tissues. The plasma is carrying nutrients and then removing waste. The white blood cells or leukocytes are important in protection from pathogens and disease. And these platelets are what are going to be important in our blood clotting when we have injury. So if you look at the tissue, we see that a lymphocyte, right, is a type of leukocyte. And then the erythrocytes are our red blood cells. So our leukocytes or lymphocytes are going to be much larger cells. And then our erythrocytes that we see are these smaller cells. And then obviously the white background is our extracellular matrix that's just the plasma part of the blood.